says Dr. France, I've heard the possibility that there might be some very interesting data in your father's basement.
This is cardiologist Robert France on an episode of Malcolm Gladwell's revisionist history titled The Basement Tapes, concerning Robert France's father, Ivan France.
Ivan France chose to devote his life to studying heart disease, specifically to understanding the role of cholesterol and blood lipids in heart attacks.
Back in the 1960s, Ivan France conducted a meticulously controlled study that would shed light on what actually happens when people cut out saturated fats and eat polyunsaturated vegetable fats instead. The study, which would be called the Minnesota Coronary Survey, took years to set up and had more than 9,000 research subjects. Since people were living in institutions, they could control exactly what the people ate. It ran for 5 years, from 1968 to 1973.
The patients in France's study would go for their meals in the cafeteria and get one of two trays. They'd look completely identical, but one tray was food cooked with vegetable oil. The other had everything cooked in saturated fat.
This was a beautifully organized study. There was lots of money, no holes were barred to try to do a good job.
To this day, it stands as one of the most rigorous diet trials ever conducted. So what does the Minnesota study show? The patients on the vegetable oil diet did end up with lower cholesterol than the people who ate food cooked with animal fats. But the vegetable oil people didn't live longer, which made no sense. They were eating the kind of diet everyone believed should help you live longer.
For whatever reason, Ivan France sat on his data for 15 years until he finally published the results in 1989.
And his study was all but forgotten for a quarter century.
That is, until researcher at the NIH, Christopher Ramsden, tracked down Ivan France's son for the old tapes containing the raw data from this study.
The people who were over 65, who had been on the diet for more than a year, the more their cholesterol was lowered, the higher the risk of an adverse outcome.
Here, by adverse outcome, he means death.
People over 65 were dying faster if they ate a so-called healthy diet. There's no good evidence that reducing saturated fat makes you live longer. The best clinical trials we have reach the opposite conclusion.
In Ramsden's paper on the Minnesota Coronary Survey, he essentially says that the reason we assumed vegetable oils are healthy up until now is because researchers weren't completely publishing the actual results of their studies. Let me remind you that vegetable oils are everywhere. In many packaged foods, chips, rice chips, crackers, salad dressings, sauces, biscuits, mixed nuts, granola bars. Most mayonnaises are basically a jar of soybean oil. I'm not in the US at the moment, but even most of these nicely packaged meals at this expensive Japanese supermarket contain these cheap vegetable oils. Most restaurants and chefs use vegetable oils because they have a neutral flavor and, well, they're cheap. People have asked me what I think about plant-based meats in the past, and one reason I'm not keen on them is because they're simulating the fattiness of real meat with a bunch of vegetable oils. Canola, soybean, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, corn, and all kinds of polyunsaturated vegetable oils have replaced saturated fats in our food supply. Okay, so why? Why specifically would vegetable oils be bad for our health? Well, average Americans today are eating 5 to 6 tablespoons of vegetable oils per day. That's around 700 calories of oil filled with polyunsaturated fat. It's almost impossible to get this amount naturally. There's so little oil per ear of corn that it takes 98 ears or 12,000 calories of corn to get you 5 tablespoons of corn oil. 625 grapes or 2,800 sunflower seeds will get you 5 tablespoons of grapeseed or sunflower oil. So a long industrial process is dedicated to ripping oil out of these tiny seeds. As mentioned earlier, polyunsaturated vegetable fats oxidize very easily. Oxidize simply means to react with oxygen. This is how metals rust, and this is why meat that you leave out turns brown after a while. Oxidation changes the structure and properties of fats for the worse. McDonald's actually used to fry their fries in beef fat, which was a really good idea because it tasted better, and the saturated fat in the beef fat is very resistant to oxidation. It's been common knowledge for a very long time that it's the unsaturated fats that are fragile, and polyunsaturated fats are far more fragile than monounsaturated fats. The main polyunsaturated fat in vegetable oil, linoleic acid, is 40 times more prone to oxidation than the monounsaturated oleic acid you find in olive oil. This is why your expensive bottle of olive oil is dark green and says to store it in a cool, dark place. Olive oil is mostly monounsaturated fat, but 10% of it is fragile polyunsaturated fat. Since light, exposure to oxygen, and especially heat all speed up oxidation, the olive oil will oxidize faster and worsen the flavor if you don't store it properly. That's because when fats oxidize, they produce oxidation products that give the fat a bad flavor, and these oxidation products are actually toxic. For example, the toxic aldehydes are one of the fat oxidation products. In fact, acetaldehyde is thought to be what makes you feel terrible during a hangover. Professor of bioanalytical chemistry in the UK, Martin Grutfeld, received some press for suggesting that vegetable oils are not a healthy cooking oil, despite the National Health Service saying so. His research showed that meals fried in vegetable oil contain 100 to 200 times more aldehydes than the daily limit set by the WHO. So if you must fry your foods at high temperatures, the far more resilient saturated fats like coconut oil or butter produce far less of these harmful compounds. Ironically, the reason McDonald's switched to frying everything in vegetable oil was thanks to Phil Sokoloff, a Nebraskan millionaire who in 1985 began spending his personal fortune on his crusade to stop others from consuming so much saturated fats, which Sokoloff thought were responsible for his heart attack. His extensive anti-saturated fat marketing campaign was effective, and eventually, McDonald's backed down and swapped oxidation-resistant beef tallow for easily oxidizable vegetable oil in 1990. The intense processing necessary to simply get the oil out of tiny seeds and into bottles easily damages them. Heat is a great way to oxidize fats, and vegetable oil is repeatedly heated long before it ever arrives in a kitchen. There are many steps to create edible oil, and several of them involve very high heat. The oil is heated to 80 degrees Celsius during the acid wash process. In the neutralization process, the oil can get up to 95 degrees Celsius.
The bleaching earth step is carried out between 90 and 110 degrees centigrade for 30 minutes.
At this point, the oil has oxidized so much that it's rancid and would taste terrible and smell awful if you ate it as is. This is why there is a final intensive deodorization process. During this extensive deodorization process, the oil is heated once again and can reach as high as 260 degrees Celsius or 500 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 125 degrees hotter than the temperature needed for deep frying. There's something called the Israeli paradox. Israel has one of the highest omega-6 polyunsaturated fat consumptions in the world. Their omega-6 consumption is 8% higher than the USA and 10 to 12% higher than most of Europe. To quote this paper, despite such national habits, there is a paradoxically high prevalence of cardiovascular diseases, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and obesity. Now, the other thing about the fragile polyunsaturated omega-6 linoleic acid in vegetable oils is it's still problematic even if not heated. Heat isn't the only way to oxidize vegetable oils. They can oxidize just sitting on the shelf. Walnut oil, for example, which has plenty of linoleic acid, will readily oxidize in just a matter of days while simply sitting in storage, as you can see here. Vegetable oils also oxidize while sitting in your body, creating toxic oxidation products like an aldehyde called 4-HNE. 4-HNE is actually considered to be the most toxic aldehyde, and this compound has been associated with aging, heart disease, diabetes, and Alzheimer's. Neuroscientist Tetsumori Yamashima has done plenty of research on vegetable oils and 4-HNE. He's published multiple papers on the damaging effects of this compound and why people need to avoid vegetable oils because they oxidize into 4-HNE in our bodies. This book of his is titled Stop Eating Vegetable Oils to Save Your Brain and Blood Vessels. He's even gone as far as to say that the real culprit behind Alzheimer's disease is vegetable oil. Now, that's just the research of one neuroscientist, but other research, like this done at the Lewis Katz School of Medicine at Temple University, found canola oil in the diet to be associated with worsened memory, worsened learning ability, and weight gain in mice. Also, Alzheimer's prevalence happens to correlate with vegetable oil consumption, but again, this is just a correlation.